I'd like to introduce you to the people who are here in the room today. There's myself, Sue Jones, and I lead on the Excellence in Volunteer Management programmes and all things volunteer management here in Warrington. We've got Chris, who's our social media and technical director, and what Chris is going to be doing, for those of you that are live on the webinar, he's going to be coordinating the messages and the chat and the questions that will be coming through. And what we'll do is we work together to bring you these webinar broadcasts every other month. And we're also responsible for facilitating the weekly tweet chat for volunteer managers, Thoughtful Thursday, which hopefully some of you have found your way to. But the reason why we're really excited here today is because we have Susan Ellis, who is here in Warrington with us. Susan, welcome. It's brilliant to have you here. How are we helping you settle in celebrating the 4th of July?
Well, I think I should get a lot of credit for having stepped into the lion's den on the day that we declared independence from England. But I feel very welcomed, and I appreciate that.
It's brilliant to have you here. And for those of you that don't know Susan, why don't you, if you're working with volunteering, first of all? So you will after today. She's one of the leading figures in volunteerism and in volunteer management, really, internationally. And if you haven't discovered her website, Energising, then do look it up after today. Make sure that's your first action point, because it's brimming with resources and support for managers of volunteers. And you also run a subscription journal, eVolunteerism.
That's correct.
Which is also well worth checking out.
And for which you are the training designs editor newly appointed.
This is true. I'm very proud to be so. Susan, just tell us briefly why you're actually here in the UK at the moment.
Well, this time I came over for a variety of meetings with different folks. I've been coming to the UK a couple times a year since 1992 and worked with a lot of different clients here. This time it's mainly meetings. I'm meeting with Bob Jackson because, and it's relevant to this webinar, we're developing a British edition of my book, From the Top Down, The Executive Role in Successful Volunteer Involvement, and Bob Jackson is anglicizing it for us all. So we're having some meetings about that, and then I came here also to do this.
No, we're really pleased that you've made time to do this, because I know you've got quite a busy schedule and you are meeting.
Well, you're all worth it.
Lots and lots of different people. And so what I'd like to do is just talk people through who haven't joined us by webinar before, just so that they can familiarise themselves with what's actually happening on the screen. And if you're joining us by webinar, what you should be able to see is a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and there's a space there for you to type questions and comments. So if you use that space, you can chat to Chris, who's managing that, and so your comments will come through to him, and then he'll be able to, if you've got a question or you're having a problem with it, if you let him know, then he'll try and help you out as much as he can. If you want to speak to us, we're hoping that some people will come live on air later on when we have our Q&A. Please press the little hand icon if you want to speak to us, and that will let us know that you want to come live on air. And if you are a tweeper, I think I don't know what the parlance is, I'm not sure. But our hashtag for today is hashtag WVA webinar. So if we want to keep a bit of a thread of conversation going during the presentation and afterwards, of course, you can give us our feedback that way as well, then that's what you need to use.
I apologize. This is tacky, but it's a kind of question. Are we actually sharing your desktop yet? Yes, because I'm confused as to why we're seeing that up there.
I think that's just because we're in the room.
But because they need to get to see the slides. Sorry about that out there in webinar land. I had to ask that question.
Well, what I think is important to sort of share with everybody, both in the room and via webinar, is that we're still quite new to doing this. So whilst I'm not apologising for that, because I think it's great that we're doing this stuff, we're learning a lot as we go along, and it's the first time really that we've felt that we've controlled having a live audience and broadcast by webinar, because we did try it out a little bit last year, but we were in a different venue and it didn't go quite so successfully. So we're confident that this time around it's going to work great. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the theme for today. And our theme is about how it takes a whole organisation to involve volunteers. And anybody that's done any kind of training work with me or listened in on any of the webinar broadcasts before will know that I'm always banging on about this, and that I'm always referencing Susan's great film clip with Volunteering Queensland, and this whole kind of theme and concept about how it takes a whole organisation. And the reason why we've got like the image there is because I often refer to the volunteer manager as being like the cog in the wheel, because I think it's really important that the volunteer manager, you know, that you see yourself as someone who has this sort of 360-degree perspective. And you might not necessarily think that right at the moment, but you do. You have the potential to sort of see out in all directions. And I also think that, you know, you're integral to keeping things moving forward within the organisation as far as volunteering is concerned, and also that will reach even further. But what it is you need the cooperation of the other people in the organisation to help you move that wheel forward. So that's what we're going to be discussing. But I'd love it if Susan just gave us a very brief kind of scene setter around your original thinking for It Takes a Whole Organisation.
Well, it started in general by the fact that any time I did any kind of workshop or wrote anything, people would say to me the following sentence: "Boy, I wish my boss had heard this." And the fact of the matter is that volunteer managers are in a critical role, but they do not have the authority to do some of the things that are needed to have the whole organization step up to the plate. And therefore, one of the most important things we do is educate up, and that's what we're going to be talking about. But unfortunately, and I've been in the field now for 41 years, I was 2 when I started, but nevertheless, that this has not changed. We still are reinventing the wheel every single time, tilting at the windmill of administrators who give a lot of lip service to how much they love volunteers and how good they are, but who in practice are really allowing volunteer managers to operate very much on their own and not as integrated as they need to be.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that gives us a lot of nods going on in the room, and I'm sure there's a lot of you sat nodding at your PCs right now. I think we can all relate to exactly what you're saying. And certainly,
or Max, to be fair.
Yes. Certainly as a trainer, it's a message that I hear an awful lot as well. I referred briefly to the film that you did when you were down under, when you were with Volunteering Queensland, which is a great film clip actually. If you just check it out on YouTube, and I think I've been tweeting it out this week, if you just put Susan Ellis, It Takes a Whole Organisation into YouTube, it'll come right up. And it's just a short film that really sort of emphasises a lot of the points and introduces these themes. So I think it'd be great to kind of show other people in the organisation possibly. But in the clip you pose a really great question, and it's often the kind of the simplest questions I think are the most effective. And the question that you ask is, why do you involve volunteers? And where you're going with that is that you're getting people to think about, well, do you know, as the volunteer manager, but do other people in the organisation know, and would they have the same answer if you went and asked everybody? And I think that, to get this consistency, it's a great question.
But it's also a great question because it cannot be answered because we don't have enough money. Because that makes volunteers a second choice, not a first choice. So
excellent. Absolutely. So this is the question that we want to kick off with, and those of you that have participated with us before will know that we like to interject the presentation with some polls to try and keep it a little bit interactive. So there should be a poll coming up on your screen. For those of you in the room, it's on the flip chart. We've got a flip chart in here with some paper and pens, and so those of you that are online, does everyone in your organisation understand why you involve volunteers? Yes, there is a clear vision for volunteering and everybody understands it. It's a bit so-so in some areas, but it could be much clearer. Or no, volunteering is seen as something kind of separate, that what I often describe it as is happening in a bubble, separate to the rest of the organisation. So Chris we've got some response coming in. Chris is doing it.
And you can raise your colour.
Yes, if you want to go for that. So we've got in the room we've got quite a lot of orange
bees.
Bees, yes, thank you. Because orange means nothing to
them. Yes, that's right, exactly. We've gone to a color system here.
It's a good job Susan's here to
Sort
just
of like the United States and its security levels are.
So, Chris, what kind of sort of feedback have we got coming in from online?
Very similar on offline. We've got 23% have got clear vision and 71% also.
Okay.
And then 6% in the last one.
Is not at all. I think it's quite encouraging then that it's a low.
That's if you believe the response.
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, the
Great
question is,
question.
it's a really very interesting thing to go back home and find out, because what you think people think that the reasons for volunteers may in fact not be what you think. So it's an interesting discussion to have. Yeah, it's very good.
So thank you for interacting with that online and in the room, because I think that's proof to us that the colour system works, providing I explain it properly. Okay. So I think I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we move this stuff forward. So we've got the kind of the understanding the general theme behind it, but so what? You know, what can we actually sort of do about this? And the way I kind of thought about it, and when Susan and I were chatting about what we were going to put together for this, those of you that do a lot of work with me will know that I'm really big on the professional development side, and volunteer managers really starting to think about your own skill sets and where it is you're heading, and how you need to be in a really good place if you're going to be supporting volunteers effectively and giving that feedback and challenging within the organisation. So the way I kind of thought about it was that we have the sort of the internal aspects, which are very much about you developing yourself as a manager and a leader. But as Susan quite rightly points out, it's not enough really to be focusing on you. You need to start there, but how do you take that forward? Well, this is where we focus on the external aspects, and as Susan puts it, educating up and out and gaining specific support. So tangible, real, actual, practical support, not just a kind of fluffy messages about how volunteers are all wonderful and we support them in the organisation. So how do we gain that buy-in? And one of the things that I want you to think about, going back to the internal aspects, because Susan's going to talk about the external stuff, is what are your strengths as a leader? What do you think of yourself as a leader? You know, if we think of you as the cog in the wheel, as we said earlier, it's vital that you look after yourself, that you're working out, and that you focus on your own development, because you're a key part of making this stuff happen. But my question is to you is what are your strengths as an individual volunteer manager? What do you bring to the party to enable this education and development to take place in your organisation? So it would just be interesting if we just get some initial feedback from that question, and then we're going to go to a poll specifically. Has anybody got anything that they want to sort of say about that in terms of what strengths they think they've got? Lisa?
Never giving up.
Tenacity, never giving up. I love that as a strength. Anybody got anything else?
The inability to hear the word no.
Not being frightened of volunteers. Right, that, you know what I mean? I think staff are sometimes nervous or not confident about it, but I am, so therefore I can spread that.
Role
Yes,
modeling.
Emma.
No, that's really good. Yeah, not being afraid of challenging,
Yeah.
of challenging volunteers. Chris,
We're not picking up the audience very well, so can you just...
relay. Yes, you know that's. Thank you, Chris. So that's fine. Have we got any comment coming in from that question at all? If nothing has changed in 40 years, what is different now? That's
Well,
a
we just said
question.
it's not changed in 20 years, and nothing is. One of the things that's different are 40 years ago when I started in the field, there were no books, no materials, no anything anywhere. It was all done by common sense and kind of folklore, passing it on around campfires with marshmallows or something. And the difference now is that somebody who does want to learn about volunteer management can actually find the material, can actually get the information, and that is very important. But we'll talk later on in the seminar about what you'll see, because we're going to talk about strategies, and I think some of that has changed.
Definitely, I think you're right. I think it's no longer good enough to sort of say that you're working in isolation. I know lots of people do say that still, but not anymore. I'm going to sort of highlight this really in the next bit that I'm just going to talk through with you, and because this is what I believe your strengths are. I think you've got tons. You have knowledge. You know stuff. How good is that? You have knowledge about good practice, you have access to knowledge, you understand the volunteering issues, like Emma's point, but, because I understand how to do that, especially why you involve volunteers. You know what experiences work and what doesn't, and you can share this, which is what Susan will come to in a moment. You're connected. If any of you tuned into our last webinar broadcast, then it was all about the network, it was all about the connecting, the sharing, and the learning, and how significant that's become. So, as we say, you're no longer working in isolation. You can draw on the expertise and the support of people coming face-to-face and virtually and online, and that can help you seek out examples, case studies. You build a credibility around what you're doing, and that then, in turn, develops your own confidence, I think. And, leading on from that, you demonstrate the required skills. You are skilled. We need to think about this as, this is a profession. This is a proper job. This isn't a nice little job, kind of.
It's improper sometimes. In a fun sort of way.
But first of all, you need to know yourself. So you need to be aware of what your strengths are. And so my question, again, for you to take away is, how well do you know yourself? And, what would your volunteers sort of say about you in terms of the way that they see you as a manager and a leader, and would you see yourself in the same way, and all those kind of questions. If you're having any kind of success in your role, and I know lots of people in this room are, then it'll be because the skills that you have are, you're a good listener, you ask insightful questions, you're a negotiator, you're an influencer, you're a leader, and you already know how to do this on a day-to-day. With your volunteers, you just need to sort of transfer a lot of that, I think, into how you manage maybe other people in the organisation. And this is more about what Susan's going to talk about. I'm going to hand over to her very shortly, so I am going to stop talking in a minute, but we have just got another poll coming up. And I wonder if Patricia will be kind enough to just reveal the next question there on the flip chart for us. And this is about leadership. To what extent do you see yourself as a leader within your organisation? Because I think, Susan, you talk a lot about leaders of volunteers. We talk a lot about volunteer management, and we have lots of debates here in the UK and further afield about the difference, because there is a distinct difference between leadership and management. So our poll questions: to what extent do you see yourself as a leader? I don't really, but I'm beginning to. I do, yeah, I need to keep working on it. Or absolutely, I see myself as a leader, but there's always more that I can do to develop this. So, which one are we going for? Okay, so we've got some feedback coming through online. And in the room, we've got a real mixture.
Well, we got a lot. I would say we have most people who really believe they are, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
The majority of people, absolutely.
We've got some people are changing their mind at the last minute, which is absolutely fine.
Maybe we should have them raise their color papers without seeing each other's like this.
Yeah. You can't crib from your neighbour.
Yeah. Well, what are you finding?
It's actually the same, really. It's split slightly more. I need to keep working on it. So in the middle.
Okay. So that's really encouraging, I think.
Well,
yeah.
Well, that's because the people who found the webinar and were tied in and connected enough are obviously the really smart ones.
Absolutely.
We can talk about all the other ones.
Yeah. I think, well, part of that, I think, for you guys, who I always talk about people who get it and people who don't get it, and you get it. So you need to go out and tell other people about that. And I know that certainly people in the room are doing a lot of positive stuff with that. So I'm going to hand over to Susan, and she's going to talk about how you then take this stuff forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. I need to begin by saying hello to everybody in the room and out in webinar land, as I call it. That's the Liberty Bell, and I am here from Philadelphia, and I'm very glad to be here today. As we've already said, it is Independence Day back home, but it's kind of fun being here. In 1976, I was here as a tourist, and there was an exhibit in Greenwich called the British Perspective on the American Rebellion. It was a wonderful thing to get the other side of the coin, so I'm remembering that as I am here today. Sue asked whether you see yourself as a leader. The equally important question, though, is do others see you as a leader? And in a very real sense, that's part of what this webinar is about today. I take it as a very important premise that how the person designated to be in charge of volunteers, when I say, the reason we say leader of volunteer involvement, I should say that in the United States we're uncomfortable with the title volunteer manager because it confuses an adjective and a noun, and you know that already. It's become the default title here. Our default title tends to be volunteer program manager. The problem with that is volunteers aren't a program. You don't have employee programs, and you know, there's not an employee program. You have, they're part of the team. So there's lots of language problems, but that's another webinar than what we can do here. So we also work with volunteers who lead volunteers. So that would be a volunteer manager, but the leader of volunteers is sort of what I use as a generic. But the reality is how the person who leads volunteers is treated by the organization is an absolute indicator of how volunteers are viewed by that organization. It is a ripple effect. And the fact is that if you are given, in the position of leader, no authority or respect, volunteers never will either. It just can't happen. And it's a very simple thing. And what's important for this webinar then is the people in this field tend to be self-deprecating and tend to be very nice because we're people. In fact, my friend Marilyn McKenzie in Canada calls us terminally nice. But the idea is that it feels selfish to many people to go and fight for the things that volunteers need. And I'd like to make the case from the beginning here that the reason we do this is not fighting for ourselves. It is advocating for volunteers. We're doing it because that's our job. Not to make our lives easier, but to do what's needed for volunteers. And I think that's really important. So one of the questions, is there a reason why this is not moving? Sue?
It could be because of what I just did to hide the control panel. It should be right now. No? Let's do it this way then.
No? All right, we're having a technical difficulty in advancing the slides.
It's okay, just bear with me one moment.
That's because you were looking at, yeah.
No. Forgive us, everybody who's not in the room.
Okay. There we go. Okay. The question relates to, are you supported now? And the fact of the matter is that we talk about support without necessarily defining it. And what I want to do first is do a quick poll question and then talk about where that is. So the question is, if you were thinking about the organization that you represent when you're in this webinar or in the room with me, is thinking about top management of your organization right now. What I'd like you to answer in the poll question is, are you supported by top management? So you have, is that been switched?
Yeah, we need to switch over. Okay. Thanks.
So if you could please fill in the poll, that would be very appreciated. I've given you 5 options this time. What, very strongly supported, mostly solid, with room to grow. 50-50 depending on the issue, mostly weak with occasional surprises, and non-existent. Okay. Interesting. Okay. What we're seeing in the room here is we're seeing everybody on A, B, or C. Is there anyone that's on, oh yeah, sorry, we have 1D, and nobody, happily, nobody is E for non-existent, but nevertheless. But majority of people are rating like orange, quite is high, mostly but with room to grow. That's because we always have room to grow, right? What do we find in the poll?
We've got 43% on 50-50.
We've got the majority of the people listening for the seminar, for the webinar, are at 50-50, which is really interesting. Now, the question is, however, how did you define support? We use that term. It's like, it reminds me of the kind of Oliver Twist thing about going up to with the bowl of gruel and saying, "More, may I have some more, please?" It's like, would you support me, please? I don't quite know what that means. And the problem we have is that I actually think that all too often we confuse support with benign neglect. By that I mean that we think that because we've been left to our own devices, we're supported. Or that another one is, well, whenever I ask for something, I usually get it, which also means if I don't ask for something, I'm just not even on the radar screen. And I have found over the years that, in fact, we are not asking for the right kinds of information for what we need from administrators. There is a handout that those of you who are listening on the webinar will have, can get online. And for here in the room, we also have a handout which we'll give you afterwards because it goes through some of the issues of what do we mean by that. So for example, are you able to get in to see your top executive? Or are there so many layers of people between you and that person that you would never, it would be considered inappropriate. Why would you need to see the executive? That says they don't get it. Okay? It's questions of, do you have a budget? Is it enough? But it's not just a matter of money. It's also things like, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, does anyone ever ask you for reports about volunteer activities? And when you give them reports, do they then ask you questions about them? Is working with volunteers something in the job description of every employee who comes in contact with volunteers, not just in yours? Because the message often is they're your job, and every time you, as the manager of volunteers, every time you go and ask someone to be good in supervising or liaisoning or teaming or partnering with volunteers, they think they're doing you a favor. Because no one's ever told them that it's their or it's everybody's collective responsibility. So part of what I want to talk about is that our responsibility is to articulate what we need. I believe that in general, it's been my experience that too few executives engage themselves in what's needed to lay a foundation for volunteer involvement. That means in making sure that policies and procedures include where volunteers fit in making it clear what is appropriate for a volunteer to do, what isn't appropriate for a volunteer to do, based on some reasoning, not just on the throw of a dart against a target. And that we are very much, I think, at the mercy of whether we happen to be working for an executive who gets it or doesn't. And that if you lose that executive and someone new comes in, it could all change overnight. And that doesn't happen in the accounting department or in the finance department. A new executive comes in and doesn't automatically change the way the paychecks are cut. But in volunteering, we're at the mercy of that. And I think that's the kind of thing we've looked at. The fact is, the reason we don't get strategic actions from executives is very often they actually don't know what it is they're supposed to do. I always say it's not like an executive drives to work in the morning or takes the tube or whatever in the morning and says, on my way there, I hope I make 2 really stupid decisions today about volunteers. I just think they do it naturally. I don't think they plan to do it. I think they do it naturally. And the reason is, I'm going to ask one more poll question. You, listening today, have you ever received formal training in volunteer management? So there's only 3 answers on that. Yes, or some, meaning a little, or no. Have you? And I'm really talking about formal training in the sense of university, but some of you may have it in courses or whatever. So let's look up. Well, here in the room, we have a number who have yes, but what's interesting is in this room we already have 6 people who said no. And we've got a bunch of you that have some. Now, I would be very surprised if that was different on the screen.
56% don't have any.
56% don't have any. Okay. Now, here's the point that's so important. If we, right here, and just to put it in context, I got my first job in volunteer management because the requirement for the job was a master's degree in anything. And I had just sort of got, that was what it said, master's degree in anything. And I had just, that was in writing, it was there. I had just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a master's in folklore and folk life, so I qualified. I couldn't make that up. And the fact is that, therefore, I was hired to do this position where they were I proudly qualified with a master's in this silly subject. Nobody knew how to teach me anything, but here's the implication. We are doing this work, and we learned most of it on the job. Now, why are we therefore surprised that everybody we work next to in our organizations is clueless? That's a very important conclusion, okay? I'm suggesting that you feel that when you have resistance, when you have people doing dumb things, I would like you to assume ignorance, not malice. We get into this. I hear people say, my organization just doesn't value volunteers, and they get angry. Well, I understand the feeling of getting angry, but if you diagnose what's going on, it's based on they don't get it. They will say things like, you mean I'm allowed to criticize a volunteer? But we have more problems managing people being too nice to volunteers than people laying down the law. We have to go to bat for them to set standards. So it's very important to understand that we are continuously in teaching mode. And I believe that most executives and colleagues really want to do the best. They really are dedicated to the mission of your organization. I believe that, and in many ways they're also overworked and underpaid and all the rest of that happens. But the point is they don't get where volunteers fit into the picture or what they can do to be supportive. And understand something. If you study to be a social worker or a nurse or a teacher or any of the professions that are quite likely to be connected to the work that we do, if you didn't get taught this in your formal education, the implication is very serious. It implies either that there's nothing to say or that it doesn't matter. Because volunteers have been around since the year one. I always said that in my folklore and folk life, I knew nothing. I had my master's and I qualified for that job, but I never knew anything about computers because at that time there were no the computer took the entire basement of the School of Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania. No one in any liberal art learned about computers. So everything I had to learn later in life about computers, I learned because it evolved around me. But volunteers have been around since the day one. You've all heard that. I don't really love it as a statement, but it does crystallize it, that the Noah's Ark was built by volunteers and the Titanic was built by professionals, okay? It should be by paid people because it's not volunteers. You know what I mean. But the point being that there have always been volunteers around. So when you get a nurse, have you ever seen a nurse work in a hospital where there were no volunteers? Or a teacher work in a school where there were no volunteers around? No. But they don't learn it, so they don't know what they don't know. And these are highly educated professionals who know their skills of their work. Here's where they are, and that's why it's so important. And it's our job to be telling them, to help them, to think of ourselves in education mode, because that's what's important. The other thing is to be very clear and specific about what you need. And an example, and it'll come up later at the end of the seminar as well, but a good example is, when was the last time you went to your executive and said, could you give me a sense of what public speaking are you going to be doing in the next 6 months or so? And I'm happy to tell you where I'm going to be going. And can you please bring along with you some of our volunteer recruiting materials? Now, some of you may have just blanched at the thought of doing that. But there are really only a couple things that can happen from that conversation. The first is that you have the kind of boss who says, wow, you're right. How silly of us to have lost that opportunity. Give me some stuff. I'll be glad to hand it out. Or you can get someone who says, that's not my job, that's your job. In which case you get to say, that's fine, but you mean to tell me you really want me to go traipse after you to every place you go to give something, you know, you have a, but there's another one too. They might say, well, I'm a little embarrassed. Those materials don't look so great. Oh, good. Now let's talk about a budget for recruiting materials. But it's until you get in there. But if you say, you don't support me, they don't know what you mean. And so you've got to give them some specifics on this, guys. So what I want to do in the rest of this webinar is I want to discuss strategies. I'm going to give a bunch of very specific, hopefully practical strategies on the fact that they gave you, your organization gave you the responsibility for volunteers. So if you don't act on that responsibility, who will? It's back to you've been given that charge and that mandate, and now it also is something that if you don't do it, the volunteers are not going to lose it. I think it also is incumbent upon us to figure out what matters, both to our executives and to the colleagues we work with in our organization. Because what we want to do is not have them work on our agenda. We need to be working on their agenda because they're the core of what's happening in the organization. And I think that if we're accurate at figuring out what everyone around us is trying to do, wants to do, needs to do, then we can frame the actions that we will recruit volunteers to take to be supportive of their priorities. And suddenly, then, they know they're not doing us a favor because we have now been listening to them. And that's a very different mindset to the way we normally ask about volunteers. The other piece of this is, I think it's critical, I started by saying that volunteer managers do not have control over many things. That's true. But there are some things that are in your control. And for example, I'll tell you right now, one of the later strategies I'm going to be talking about is recognition events. You're in charge of recognition events. We don't do as much with recognition events as we need to. So the first thing is, what can you control? And then do something about that as a starting point. And that's where I'm looking at that issue. Keep in mind also that it is my general theory in life that it is always easier to apologize than ask permission. If you go and say, can I do this, they're going to tell you no, and they're going to tell you no based on things like risk management, too risky, too this, too that. You don't go and do it with 700 volunteers on day one, but you can pilot test something and then say, we've been trying this out, and if they go, you didn't ask permission, you say, you told me to be responsible for volunteers here. That's in my control. You didn't say I had to come to you every single time. Do you get every single volunteer you recruit approved? No. So it's that kind of thing. Little gutsiness is part of the job. That's part of the strengths. Add that, Sue, the next time.
I'm
Gutsy.
tweeting gutsy volunteer management.
Oh, she's tweeting gutsy volunteer management. Okay, great. That's meant lovingly. You do understand.
We understand that.
We understand that. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to start with strategy one. Actually, I should just ask, since we have the audience here, does anybody feel burning the need to say something, or yeah, or amen, or something? Okay. Strategy one is talk in fundraising terms. Now, the reason I say this is because of what I said earlier, that all too often when we talk about volunteers, they say, well, they're cheap labor. You know, they're free. Of course they're not. We know that. But the real issue is that I can't tell you how often someone will say to me, oh, we can't fill in the blank. Send someone to this conference or pay the enrollment for everyone ready or whatever it is. We can't do that because right now we're focused on fundraising. And I want to grab the person by the lapels and shake them and say, have you ever seen a check that writes itself? You know, they don't get the correlation. So that's part of what it is. But it begins with understanding that we are sitting on a gold mine, that the potential is there, limitless, I believe truly, for finding any and every skill in the world that might willingly, happily be donated to your organization. Now understand, as a volunteer, now understand, if you meet it every Wednesday at 9 a.m., it's a job, and that's paid for. But if it's the type of skill and the type of input that you can benefit from on a mutually determined kind of schedule, we have access to that. No one else has that. But nevertheless, organizations will put resources of time and money to raising money and not raising people. We are in the people-raising business, and we ought to start using that vocabulary so that we understand it. I also think we need to be better at using the vocabulary of time donors. There are money donors and there are time donors. I think just using that kind of parallel conversation is really helpful. A new one that I saw just within the last 6 months that I like a lot is philanthropist. Now, obviously, that's funny. I mean, you know, it's cute. But I think it's also pretty powerful. We need to find some philanthropists. Well, we already have skillanthropists. I mean, it's that going to where their heads are. And right now, and we're living in a very bad economic time all over the world, certainly for nonprofits and government, where most volunteers are involved, so that's important. The other thing is, that's connected to this speaking the language of fundraising, is to recognize that it is probably true, at least I hope it's true, that your organization has a fundraising strategy. Most do. They figure out where we think we can find the money, how do we go get it. The question is, does it have a volunteer development plan? But the other part of that that's so important is to understand where volunteers fit on what I call the continuum of supporters for the organization. And the continuum is, for example, if you have members, if you have a membership part of your work, the correlation there with volunteers, people who donate money, people who might be clients of your organization, or if you're in performing arts or cultural arts, your audience, your public in that sense. The fact is that people move in and out of those roles. It's a continuum. They move in and out of those roles over time. If I give you a check, a donation of £10, something which is considered pretty small, I guarantee you someone in your organization will cash that check or deposit that money. They will start a record on me, and somebody in development there, someone in fundraising, eyes will sparkle as they think of me dead with a will. Meaning that any fundraiser worth his or her salt thinks in terms of cultivating the donor. You get a small donation, you hope and work toward getting it to be larger. Yet over and over and over again, when we have volunteers, what happens? It's not worth it. We don't need it. It's not worth it. And that's because, that's the whole argument, for example, against part-time volunteering or single days of service or whatever. Now, again, that's a whole other webinar and those kinds of things. But the reality is that it's never wasted for a person to come in and know your organization, because that person then becomes a supporter, part of that continuum. They may give money, they may not. The other thing is that you may have somebody who writes the check, but 3 other members of their family are also volunteers. So this idea that the volunteer world is a silo of poor older people, which is, or poor younger people, depending on what the image is in your agency, and then all the other donors, the bigwigs, are over here, that doesn't make sense. We also know all of the data tells us, and that's the thing about, quote, research, there's a lot of research that shows in the United States and also here and in other parts of the world that people who volunteer their time tend to give more money over time than non-volunteers, because it's much harder and much riskier and much more costly to give your time than to give money. And so even if the only reason your executive pays attention is in the hope that some more volunteers become donors, financial donors, it at least is an argument that's worth making. And the final thing about this is, and it's amazing to me how rarely this happens, do you, on a routine basis, compare the lists of people who give money to the lists of people who give time? Here in the room, how many of you routinely take those 2 lists and compare them? I do not have a hand up in the room. It does not surprise me. But all I can say is, duh. Because, and this is an example of, I realize you don't have a list of donors, but your executive can compare that list. And what the thing is, what happens? You learn something no matter what the answer is. If you have no connection whatsoever between the names on the money list and the names on the time list, you know you're missing opportunities in both directions, because you could be asking volunteers for money as well as time if you do it properly. And you can be asking people who give you money if they or others in their family want to give time as well. So there's missed opportunities. If it's all the same people and nobody's any different, you're also missing opportunities, because it means you're not going beyond your circle for either group. But unless you compare them, you aren't going to get to that point. The second strategy is to be the in-house educator, and we've been talking about this as we go along anyway. The first thing is that it's important, I think, to request opportunities to actually deliver formal training. Some of you need to say, we've never trained, because that's one question you might ask of the staff, and you might do this either formally or informally, is say, and how many of you have ever gotten training in working with volunteers? And we've already concluded that we haven't, so why would we think they would? But if you can go to the executive and say, you know, I just did a survey, we've got 22 staff members, and 22 people told me they've never had more than an hour talking about this. Well, propose to do some training. Now, if you don't know how to do the training, go to somebody like Sue Jones or whatever, or get other training available that work together on it. But the point is, find out how you train these people. But they don't need the same training that we in volunteer management need. They don't need to be taught, for example, about how to recruit volunteers. That's sort of a job we do. What they do need to be taught is, how do I partner with volunteers? How do I welcome someone on their first day? How do I deal with it when a volunteer makes a mistake? How do I actually recognize someone? And you know why they need to know that? They don't get thanked. We live in a world in which we think that you get thanked by a paycheck. Wrong. I can prove it to you because I have to pay you even the week I fire you. You see, payment is for turning up. I hope no one has ever signed a work contract that says, and I understand I will be paid in the weeks in which you like my work. Okay? Money is not a thank you. Money is an obligation. But my fact is that a lot of folks don't know how to praise or say nice things. So that's the kind of stuff that you really want to do. Very important is ask to be part of the induction process of all new hires. Okay? And some of you are nodding your head, so I take it some of you already do that. But if you don't, that's very important because, again, there are choices that are made as to what you tell a new employee. If the choice is not to tell a new employee about the volunteer component and about how they can interface with volunteers, if that's not part of induction, do not be surprised that the message that's sent is this is optional. And you know what? You may discover, because I did at the court, family court was where I was hired first, I discovered the person running, we call it orientation, was thrilled that I was willing to take a half hour because it gave him 30 minutes less talking. So you never know what the reaction might be. Other ways to teach include, sometimes if you're in a large organization, you need to consciously go to staff meetings and ask to be in the agenda of unit meetings or staff meetings, and then have something meaningful to say. Engage them in a discussion of some question. They need to see you visibly, but also that you're going to hold them as a unit accountable to what they're doing. When necessary, take a new staff member or someone who seems to be struggling out to lunch, or it can be Dutch treat, but the point is take some time to talk to that person and offer some support. I think we need to demonstrate that this is truly a field. These days there are all kinds of websites and articles and materials that you can circulate to department heads and to others, that sort of teachable moment of information. But we have to be conscious of our need not to assume that others know what we know. They don't. Now someday if you do your job well, maybe they will, but right now they don't. The other thing is, it's so easy in this to talk about the people that are obstacles to us, the resistant staff. When in fact, in most organizations, there are always shining stars who are very supportive. I would really nurture them, give them some recognition. I would take them to lunch. And what you want to do is say, can you help me figure out what it is that will help win over the others who don't seem to be as supportive as you are? Because if it's peer-to-peer, if one social worker is talking to another social worker, it's more effective than if you're always the person talking in favor of volunteers. So all of those things are strategies for getting people to understand that they have a role to play with volunteers as well. Along with that is strategy 3 of listen to legitimate concerns. You know, as we've said it before, there's this ridiculous halo effect around volunteers. I often say when I do a volunteer recruitment, volunteer recognition event, I'm often the after-dinner mint after a recognition. I have to listen to either the executive director or the chair of the board, who is him or herself a volunteer and doesn't acknowledge it, get very ministerial and say, very clergy-like. I forgot here, ministerial means something else. Clergy-like to say, and you volunteers, you are the heart and soul. Yea, verily, you are the lifeblood and the spine of this organization. And we get to this, you know, kind of halo effect. First of all, I always find they're wondering what vital organ is left for the paid staff. You know, the kidney or the liver. Something you can't live without, but it doesn't look good on a tote bag, right? Okay. But the fact of the matter is that every once in a while, now never in Warrington, I might add, but every once in a while, and you may want to hold on to something because the ground may shake, even through the internet, every once in a while, I have actually come upon, are you ready, a mediocre volunteer. And by that I mean that we have to allow people to express their concerns. What they're worried about is that we're so misty-eyed with our love, we're besotted with volunteers, that we're not going to understand their problems. We need to let them tell us they're worried. We need them to say, well, what if they're not accountable? Who's going to be left holding the bag? That's a good question. And so first you need an answer for it. Will they have to do the work the volunteers didn't do? Will they have to fix the work a volunteer might have screwed up? But the real issue is if you allow staff to talk to you about what worries them, you can acknowledge that you're right, that could be a problem. The good news is, I know that, and we're working around that. So for example, you'll never get someone who isn't qualified if you've told us the qualifications you need. Or here's the training we do about confidentiality, just so that you know. Because it's not somehow self-evident that the paid staff keeps secrets and the volunteers gossip. In fact, it's actually more often the other way around, but that wouldn't add that little thing. That's just insiders here for the webinar. And so on that level, we need to be really aware and listen. Because when we encourage people to express it to us, they won't be as, you see, part of it is they worry they'll be dumped on with anybody and everybody who's walked in the room and that they'll have to live with it. Now, why would you want to be open to that? So if they realize that you're saying, like, talk to me, what could be the obstacles in this role? What might be the pitfalls? What do you want to really warn me against not doing? Because when you've done that, then we can accommodate, and I'm sorry, I just realized that the picture came over the words, but accommodate valid issues by adapting to what they say. So you want to adapt volunteer roles to that. For example, maybe someone says, if you put somebody here Monday morning, we're going to go nuts because it's our busiest time of the week. Fine, maybe they're right. Let's not put somebody there Monday morning. It might be, we want to have volunteers, but it's really an interruption for us to continuously have to answer questions all the time. Well, you want to differentiate between, I would really rather never talk to a volunteer, from, you know, you're right, and maybe this is a busy enough unit that we need to recruit a volunteer shift leader to help you on that. So it has to do with being open to the fact that they may be raising something. And the other thing is minimizing repetitive training. Sometimes what we really do is we really expect overworked staff to drop everything 3 times a month and train somebody new. Well, maybe we need to videotape them doing one great training and then have them show that to a new volunteer. Or we recruit a group of volunteers whose whole job is trainers and buddies to new people, and we work with them. But we will never get to that unless we listen. Along with that, strategy 4 is address problem behavior by volunteers if it does appear. If a lot of us are saying, we want you to treat volunteers as if they were equal team members. The problem is we don't do that. They get away with murder. We're worried about criticizing them. Or somebody higher than you says, you can't fire that person, they give us too much money. Or they're married to the person who gives us too much money. Or they're sleeping with the person who gives us too much money. You get the scenario. The fact is that it has to be made clear that volunteers they'll be real work for volunteers, that you will be finding the right volunteers for the right roles, and that therefore if someone doesn't do well, there will be an attempt, I mean firing I hope doesn't happen to the very end of something, but that you will train people, that you will work with them, that they're allowed to be criticized. If you're unwilling to do it, then staff is right to be wary of working with volunteers. The other thing is, if you're unwilling to do it, every volunteer who's doing the job right will get the message that their good work doesn't matter. So again, another webinar topic, but I see it as important because if you really want to engage everyone in the organization in welcoming volunteers, they need to feel that they're not opening Pandora's box of problems they can't anticipate because no one will ever handle them. We're coming close to the question and answer period. So once you've challenged, once you've allowed people to tell you what they are worried about, and once you're taking care of performance standards for volunteers, the next strategy is to challenge remaining resistance. The fact is that all too often units and individuals are given the right to say, no thank you, I don't want to volunteer working with me. How many of you here in the room have ever had someone turn down, I don't mean an individual volunteer, but even starting a volunteer assignment? I've got a bunch of hands up in this room. And that's why it's on the list, because I know it's true. The fact is that I say to executives, if you let a unit or a person say, I don't want a volunteer here, we're not the right place, do you understand, Mr. or Ms. Executive, that they're saying you're stupid? And they look at me. And I say, yeah. What they're saying is, you've created a volunteer involvement strategy, you've hired someone to run it, but you've let somebody else say, they're wrong. And what we've got to do is stand up for the fact that you can craft certain work and designs and all that, but that there is no actual position, there is no unit where it wouldn't be appropriate for the right volunteer to do the right kind of work. So you've got to challenge it. Question why? The other thing is we party to this by saying, oh, I wouldn't want to send a volunteer into a unit that doesn't want them. And so the unit wins. They learn. They tell one another, just so you know, they'll never push it. What you got to do is say, we're going to practice this, and you know what? I'm going to tell the person who comes in, I'm going to recruit them saying, you're a pioneer in this unit, and I want to hear what happens. You're a spy. Volunteers like that. That's the funny thing about it, right? You know they would. Can you imagine? I'm recruiting you to be an internal spy. Here's your little pen camera.
They get a uniform.
They get a spy. Yes, right, exactly. And then, but the real point here is, if necessary, be willing to go above both of you to the managers who have more authority. And that's what volunteers are owed. So that's why I'm saying it. And along, you can see where this is a continuum. Be proactive. And part of that means don't wait to be asked to create a volunteer role. See what needs to be done and suggest ways that volunteers might, in fact, be helpful. And make it clear that the knowledge of trends and issues in volunteerism, virtual volunteering is a great example. You say to the person who knows nothing about volunteer management, virtual volunteering, and they look at you like you're from the moon. What do you mean? We need to be able to say, do you understand how many people would be happy to give us their time via computer and they don't have to come in here? What do you mean? Well, how about a cyber deputy? Would you like someone to do online research for you? Or could somebody edit your press release or give you a critique of something or translate something into another language virtually? So it's up to us to kind of demonstrate that. And it is up to us. You know, one of the benefits of volunteers is to experiment. Volunteers can try things before you even know if you should go out to find money for it. And that's not the same as they're free. It's that they are cutting edge. They can be where the action is and experimenting it. And that's one way we show to the organization that we're meeting their needs by listening to what's going on and doing that. So I've just whipped through a whole lot of things, and I really would like to have a little bit of a Q&A. I have some other strategies on the other side of it. But first of all, Chris, is there something that has already come in as a question? No? Nothing yet.
Nothing yet.
They're all breathing heavily.
They are.
Then
Taking it
how
all
about in
in.
the room? Any questions or thoughts? they're gobsmacked.
Fantastic. We have got to.
Yes, we do.
Laura.
Yes, please.
It's just a question around volunteer retention and the whole organisation.
Right.
Because I think for a long time, talked to volunteers about the importance of retaining volunteers. And what I'm seeing within my organisation at the moment is that volunteers are actually moving on faster in some ways than in the past. They seem to be kind of developing really good skills and getting good experience, perhaps because the roles are more meaningful in some ways that they're being involved in, and then moving on faster than volunteers have done in the past. And I just wondered around whether those organisations have experienced similar things and how you kind of sell or how you manage this in terms of staff expectations and whole organisation expectations.
Go ahead. Just for the benefit.
Yes, of course. I was going to say, the question relates, you can hear us a little bit to make sure, the question relates around retention and the fact that sometimes we almost feel like we're working counter to ourselves, which is we've increased the benefit of volunteering to the volunteer, they're growing better, they're moving on to other more exciting things, and they're leaving, and then we end up saying, well, maybe, the question is, of course, what's the answer? Let's have the dullest things possible so that people, it's an interesting question. But I think, let me tell you in relation to this subject what I hear when you say that. I think we need to have conversations with our organizations as to what are the measures of success. We're allowed ourselves to come up with our own measures of success, and that's wrong. But also when we're being told that retention is something that we ought to be concerned about, we need to be able to answer, I'm not sure I think that's a measure of success. The other question is, how do you define retention? People will always say to me, how long do you think someone should be remaining a volunteer? And I can't answer that question, okay? But I do have a definition for retention. I personally, this is the Susan Ellis definition of retention. I'm not saying others necessarily buy it, but mine is that I think retention is that a volunteer remains with you for the length of time at least to which they originally committed when they came on board. The problem is we don't ask them. We don't want to hear the answer. The old-fashioned form of volunteering was when you came in, we assumed you'd be there till you died. That seems to come up a lot in the summer, but we don't want to know it. And that's also why people drop off unexpectedly, because we have not given them a way to say, I need to leave, so they kind of withdraw on us. I think everybody should be asked, what do you consider your initial commitment to be, or what do you have in mind? Now, some people will not know the answer. They go, well, I don't know, and then you get to say, great. How about we say 6 months, and we're going to make, and at the end of 6 months we'll get you, we hope you'll stay longer, but maybe this won't be right for you or for us, let's start. And now your record keeping systems have to let you put in what they said, because then if somebody has stayed the 6 months and given you great service, you haven't lost them. They may have stayed longer. In fact, someone, you might say, actually they stayed 9 months. They said 6 months. They stayed 9 months. And yes, they're gone, but we knew that. We planned for it. So it's one of those teachable moments. The other thing is retention in and of itself. I mean, people aren't staying at jobs forever anymore. People aren't staying married forever anymore. Quite seriously. We're in a disposable life kind of mode. Or what was it somebody said, what was in beta mode?
Well, yeah, life in perpetual beta.
Yes, yeah. Right. And so the other thing is that what's important isn't how much time they've put in, it's are they accomplishing something while they're with us. So of course you're nodding your head, you're right, but we've got to be able to answer that when we're held to that retention question. That's really my issue. I should tell you also, part of the thing is we may be keeping people for a long time, but they stop being effective after 2 months. But they're there. That's also whenever you give awards for hours, you may be, in fact, rewarding your slowest people with the biggest awards. If it takes Sue 10 hours to do what it really takes me 20 hours to do, we've accomplished the same thing, but I'll get double the thanks because I took me 20 hours and only took her 10. I gave 20 hours. She gave 10. We both accomplished the same thing. So, any other questions? Did we get somebody else?
So we're saying, what about projects you say, we can't involve volunteers because our staff don't have the time to give volunteers the support that they need? You probably challenging that, even if you think it might be true.
Well, in other words, that someone is saying that they're told they can't involve volunteers because the staff is saying we don't have time to support them. Well, again, that may be correct, but that means that it has to be taken to a higher authority. It is, after all, only the executives who can say what the staff will spend their time on. And so it's a good example of listening and helping to, it's sort of like you're either calling them on what they're saying or you're troubleshooting what they're saying. If in fact they're using this as an excuse and the executive says, but I'm willing for them to spend the time on it, now you have diffused that issue. On the other hand, if the executive says, well, you get to say, look, I'm limited in what I can do if no one at the front line is going to work with volunteers. We can create other formats of volunteering. So it's a great example of listening and then acting on what you've been told, but being willing to go higher.
Tina has a question.
Yes, Tina.
I think it's stormed on me the answer, but I was saying that in my organisation, I've got very strong support at the top, and they do talk about volunteering by executives.
Yes, her organization is telling us she gets very good support, and they talk about volunteers and all that.
However, for me, the big
But, there's a but, as you knew was coming.
it's the middle management,
Ah.
the supervisors or the team leaders.
Absolutely.
And I suppose some of what you've said in terms of the executives then should be speaking to them is probably the answer, but I just want to say that
Oh, it's
for me, that's
a very important point. In fact, I think it's such an important point that in our online training program, Everyone Ready, we actually we have a 1-month focus on the middle manager as a topic. I really do think middle managers are often the biggest obstacle in an organization, in that they're caught in between an executive that might say you're going to have volunteers, but also then there are frontline people who are the people who report to them saying, I don't have time for this, I don't whatever. Plus, if they feel that their unit or department is being held to certain, it may not be retention, but to certain other standards, they may actually see volunteering as diverting them from achieving their real goals. So, first of all, I think it's very important to be aware of that possibility, to recognize that those people are feeling powerless in the situation in a way. They want to exercise power, but they've been told they have to do something they really don't do. I think special training for that group is part of it, and I do think getting an executive to see it. I think also going in and talking not only to the front line, but going to that middle manager and saying, what would help your unit? What do you see as unique in your unit? Are you feeling comfortable with this or uncomfortable? And then kind of educating one-on-one in some ways as you go along. But you're 100% correct that that could be a real invisible roadblock, but a very powerful one, because they are the ones who say how work is divided in their unit and what people should be spending time on. They also are evaluating the staff. Okay, they're the ones who do initial evaluation, not the executive. And so if they feel that person's wasting all that time with volunteers, that's going to do exactly the opposite. I shouldn't be answering these questions all by myself.
No, you should.
Oh.
They don't want to hear from me. I can do that anytime.
Sure they do.
I think something that I'm kind of just reflecting on as I'm listening is, and I think it's a theme that comes up a lot for me, a lot of what you're saying is about how we frame stuff. It's about how we position it. It's about the words we use, the language we use. That seems to be coming through a lot in the messages, you know, that you're giving here. And I think that we need to take time to think about that stuff,
right,
and talk to the different departments, different areas, different levels, whoever they are, in the language that they understand. Or we need to frame it as a question rather than as a sort of hurried in with a solution that we think we're trying to fix things for everyone.
And also to realize that just as in recruitment, we know that the word volunteer repels as often as it attracts. We know that in recruitment. But not everybody hears that word the same way. Well, that's true in an organization as well. So, among other things, I really encourage you to, as often as you can, say, if the right volunteer did such and such, so you're always putting that adjective, or if the volunteer with the credential does this, so that you're not making volunteers interchangeable parts, because they're not any more than the employees are. People go, well, volunteers, we have confidentiality, and you say, excuse me, don't you have a custodian or a janitor? Yes. Does that person get to see the records? No. Well, they're on your staff, and suddenly you discover it isn't pay that makes the difference, it's function. So it's that is a matter of learning it. Sometimes you can say, okay, I tell you what, let's not call them volunteers. Think of them all as interns. Does that make it better? And often, just that terminology change does. And the one I like is the activist one. This fits with July 4th. You know, a lot of people think that volunteers come in with their hearts and their hands. The problem and the positive is they also come in with their brains and their mouths. Now, that's either super threatening, because what they prefer is if you brought them in blindfolded and gagged, or it's very positive. So you might say, yeah, tell you what, let's refer them all as community activists. Parenthetically, if you said to your organization, we're now going to call it the Community Activist Program, there will be people who will go apoplectic, which is when you discover that what they want is help and not input. But, again, another seminar, a webinar. Yeah?
Can I just make a comment? Something that I've heard from organisations recently, because of the high unemployment and stuff like that at the moment, job centres are making people go and find out jobs.
Oh, yes.
So what's happening within organisations? They're getting a lot of referrals, going to induction and not turning up. And this is affecting the motivation of the staff within those organisations.
That's right. The question relates to, particularly in times of high unemployment, and that here in England, there are people who are being told by their employment counselors, to, is that what you're saying, that to go do this and so there's not any real interest there. This is not dissimilar from other mandates that have been around for a long time. It's just that it's got a more literally life and death survival part to it. But obviously it's connected to college or younger students who are told you have to do some hours of service before you graduate, or someone who's in the justice system and does alternative community sentencing or something like that. So there are other examples of it. But right now, and again, it's a broader, for those of you in the room, I'm happy to deal with that more after the webinar is over. But for those on the webinar, the real point is, number one, I think you need to discuss with your executive what your philosophic stance on it is as an organization, because you may not be a place that can provide retraining for people who are chronically unemployed. On the other hand, you might be, and that may be something that you want to do, but that shouldn't just be your decision in voluntary management. But the other piece of it is that there is nothing inherent that someone referred to you in a job hunting capacity cannot become a wonderful, committed volunteer who stays with you for a long time. A lot is it's self-fulfilling prophecy. They get sent to us by this. They're feeling very negative, and we kind of, all right, let's put them in this one thing, and we end up like we just keep it on a negative level, as opposed to being able to say, I know you were sent here. Do you really want to be here? Is this where you would pick to go? What about, get them and then welcome them and not like label them. It's like the scarlet letter or something, put you on their forehead as an unemployed. And the fact is to say, but I will tell you something, we're going to be asking you to do something important, so we hope you get a job. We're not going to sit here and hope you don't get a job so that we retain you. But let's say this, when you get a job, what we're hoping is, first of all, that you will help us, even if it has to be on an evening or whatever, or virtually, to train your replacement with us. So right off the bat, you're discussing it as a factor rather than as the defining issue. I also believe, and I do this with all mandates, I really believe that we have to become much more interested in whether people stay in service and why, than how they got to us in the first place. Because people get to us from all kinds of ways. And parenthetically, when your kid comes home and says, but mom or dad, I told them you would do it, that's a mandated service too. So it's all kinds of different things. Is that a question?
We do have one more question.
I will have you the last one and then
one more. This is from David. Is there any advice on working with non-volunteer managers to overcome their staff's resistance to volunteers?
Right. Well, that sounds like it's the middle management question a bit. But the point is, yes, everything that I've been saying works no matter what the audience is, which is getting them, allowing them. Don't start with volunteers are great, you should love them. Bad approach. Instead, say, let's look at what's happening here. What would you say? It's very simple, really, in some ways. It's hard, but simple. In some ways, what you start with is, what do you think is happening here right now with volunteers that you actually think is positive? And they'll very often tell you about stuff happening somewhere else that they see in the organization. But then you say, okay, but what concerns you? That's the question. It isn't what's bad about volunteers. It's what concerns you. What could go wrong that concerns you? Or have you had an experience already here with volunteers here that concerns you? You'll also discover something I call the history you didn't create syndrome, which means that if this person comes to you from another organization, they may have had a bad experience with a volunteer that was not well managed at that place, and they're now extrapolating because they've been burned. They trained somebody and the person left.
It's always going to be like that.
Yes, exactly. But it's back to that listening, but then also providing some training. I think all of us in this room know that it took us a while to learn how to, first of all, work one day with a senior citizen and the next day with a 16-year-old. Nobody else is asked to do that. We are. Often doing something, even the same job. The other thing is to learn that balance between what is appreciation and pleasantness and everything else versus cloying niceness that nobody believes. What is criticism and how do you do it? I mean, we're learning that. They want to know how to do it. They don't, again, because paid people aren't nice to each other. It's really true. And in fact, the more it's a social service type agency, the worse it is. Maybe not in England, but I sure can tell you it's that way otherwise. All right. I'd like to continue, and I will, something we didn't say at the beginning is this. We have 15 more minutes. But the way this platform works, we don't get cut off at the 3:30 mark where we are here. It might be a totally different time zone wherever you all are listening. That means that we may go over just to finish some of the points made, and we'll try to finish at least the main points that are on the slides by then. But for those of you who want to remain involved, we may stay a bit longer, and of course for those in the room, that's one of the benefits of coming to something live. So. Okay, thank you. Strategy number 7 is enlist volunteers in ownership of and advocacy for their program. And I did use the word program here, even though I thought about what else I could say. But in other words, and you've all heard this, I think, that we should not use the possessive. They are not our volunteers. Certainly they're not they may be the organization's volunteers. So if you're talking to the executive and you're using the our volunteers, meaning the executives and yours and everybody else's, but the really important thing is you are their leader or coordinator or manager or whatever you want to call it. And that's a very important perspective that we have to realize. I believe it's very important for anyone who is in charge of volunteers to create an advisory or a steering team or committee. And the reason for that is that we have got to model what we say. In fact, one of the reasons why everyone believes volunteers are ours is that we act like they are. We make all the decisions for them. We do all the things for them. We are not sharing our work with them. And I think that's a criticism. Another thing is that whenever you go and do a proposal of any sort, even when you go to one of those staff meetings we talked about, don't go alone. Bring the right volunteer with you. Have the volunteer make part of the presentation. Model the fact that you believe that the volunteer is confident enough to do that, rather than, trust me, volunteers are great. Make it sort of obvious that you can have a conversation with this person. Another thing is, and I'm going to ask the people in the room this, how many of you in the room right now back home have at least one volunteer whose entire assignment, the only thing they do in your organization, is specifically help in running the volunteer effort, but not in a clerical way, not filing or whatever. How many of you have that? 2 of you and a half. I can see that hand. Okay. What does the volunteer do for you, or
They are developing training for volunteers.
They do the training for other volunteers.
They're developing the packages, but
They're developing the packages that will be trained. Great. And what do they do for you?
They coordinate a team of fellow volunteers.
They coordinate their team leaders of fellow volunteers, okay? Well, here, is that a hand up back there?
Oh, no.
Careful, it's like bidding at an auction, you go home. You go home with the internet or whatever. Okay, my point is that we in the volunteer field, I have to say, I ask this question a lot, and it's very disappointing what the answer is. Because we are reluctant to share our work with volunteers. And so what are we role modeling? Why are we surprised somebody else feels negative about it if we won't do it? Now, part of it is, some people say, but it's skimming off the top. I'm supposed to bring in volunteers for everybody else. If I bring them in for me, well, no, that's not the logic. The logic is if it's important to have a strong volunteer involvement effort for the sake of the organization, then anything you can do to expand your ability to make it a strong volunteer involvement in turn helps the organization. And there are many people, what you don't do is take somebody who comes in who says, I really want to be a mentor to a child. No, please help me recruit other volunteers. Bad approach. What you do is you create the position description for what you need help with, and you recruit people who actually want to do that. And now you're modeling the same thing. But if you can't show that you're sharing and that you're partnering with volunteers in a serious way, then you're telling everybody, do what I say and not what I do. And that's of concern. Okay, strategy 8 is communicate effectively and creatively. And this is something Sue, picking up on what I said is very important. Know your audiences and speak to them in different ways. In recruitment, I often say that the sign of an inexperienced recruiter is printing up a brochure, printing up 5,000 copies of a brochure, and then saying, where will I put these? Okay. Now, these days, we don't do much printing anyway, but the problem is we figure out one way to talk about volunteering, and then we say it forever and ever and ever, no matter who we talk to. Big mistake. In terms of in-house education, it's a big mistake. Think about what's already come out here. You're going to use certain terminology and certain ways of approaching it with your top executives. But when you go to the middle managers of some of these units, you're going to need to talk their language and discuss things in their way. So being aware of who you're communicating with is really important. Something that I feel very strongly about is and remember, the underpinning thing here is we're looking at what's in your control and then do something about it. That's how these strategies are developed, the things you can control. I cannot have as a strategy, fire every paid staff member who's terrible to volunteers. That would be silly to say because we have nothing to do with that. But reporting we do. And I think we usually as a field don't like reports. But I have a poll question for you. The poll question is, are you required by someone in your organization to report on volunteers? So it's either no, once a year, quarterly, every month, or whenever I wish. Okay. No. I've got quite a number, I've got about 4 or 5 no's in the room, and we have a few oranges. The real issue, D is every month, which is what called blue. We only have a few people do that blue. Okay, but we're all over the map. How it's happening on the...
We're mixed again. We've got 27% saying no, 27 every month.
Okay.
27 quarterly.
Well, you're going to love this. Just because your bosses are not smart enough to ask you to report does not let you off the hook from doing so. Why? Because a report isn't your report. It is bringing to light what volunteers are accomplishing. It is something we do because individual volunteers don't see the collective whole. Remember Sue's graphic of the wheel with us as the hub and all the other spokes. The fact is that we need to bring that picture to the organization. So I think it is really very important to do it, but not just data, but that what I call the so what factor. You don't say, the summer youth program was begun this month. So what? In other words, that's what your job is. Your job is to start the summer youth program. What you want to do is always think about who's reading this and who can use it. So if you can say, this is the 3rd annual summer youth program, and this year we are delighted that 50% are returning from last year's students, which means not only that they liked it, but that they're already oriented and trained, or inducted and trained. So something that, or we said this year that we were going to get young people from within a 50-mile radius and representing all points of the geography, whatever, we've done that. Whatever it is, make it clear. Much more, you can give them whatever data they want, but make sure you give a description of it, a content, not just how many have you got, and is it more than last year? Some organizations should cut their volunteer numbers in half and do a better job with what's left. Again, another webinar. Also, in your report, credit employees who did something well. Here's a question: who do you share reports with? You, especially today with electronic reporting, I would like to say that I think every volunteer ought to see your monthly, and by the way, I do think you should report monthly. I think if you're not using reports to monitor. If it's quarterly or annually, it's just information. It's not management tool. But I think that a volunteer should see what they're part of. It's kind of supportive of them to know they're part of this collective effort. I would send a copy of it to every department head in the organization. Why? Because you're reporting on volunteers in their units. So again, the report, even if it's not normally done, no one ever got fired for giving out information about the work they're responsible for. Just so you know, in the court they once said, your reports are too long, Susan. I said, well, how do you suggest I cut them? And they said, why don't you take one sentence out of every paragraph? I thought that was really funny. Anyway, I share the reports with everyone. Another thing there is reporting and sharing and communicating is more than just a report. It's email, bulletin boards. Photographs, photographs, photographs. You should have an well, these days, I used to say you should have a digital phone attached to your hip, or at least a case for it. These days, we all have our cell phones, and you can take pictures. Pictures are incredibly important for fighting stereotypes, for showing energy, for recognizing people. Your website, if I go to your website right now, your organization's website, do I see volunteers mentioned? Are there photographs? Is it up to date? Too many websites operate like a printed brochure. They never change. You know what they call a website that never changes? A cobweb. Okay? And we need to be able to think about how we're exploring this. Surprise people. In other words, show something volunteers do that's totally unexpected. I just learned, for example, yesterday that at the National Trust they had a big event, and they served at the event this hard cider that was actually called Volunteer Brew. Okay? Is that what's called, Volunteer Brew or something like that? I know. But it's made by volunteers. It's part of a historic process where they're showing how to make hard cider, and the volunteers have actually created a label for it, and it's volunteer. I think that's a great story, you know, and it's one of those, what, volunteers are doing that for us? That type of thing is really useful. Having some fun is important, and just in general that we need to shine in the spotlight. We're coming toward the end. Grab the opportunity of recognition events, and please don't be a wedding planner. I am so tired of hearing people talk about the color of the tablecloth, the menu, and the gifties that are given out. Let people who like planning weddings do it. You know, volunteers can actually plan their own parties, and it's not wrong to do that, because the idea is it's not the party that's the gift, it's the getting together that's the gift. And you know, what I want you to do is recognize that a volunteer recognition event, remember, is in your control, and it ought to be an educational process, particularly educating up, because it may be the only time all year that you get some top administrators there doing the thank you to some of the volunteers. What do I mean by educating up? First of all, make sure you thank the paid staff in anything you say. Ideally, by the way, I'd get rid of the luncheon or whatever. I would make it an ice cream social or just tea and biscuits. I don't care. But have as many people there as possible is more effective than limiting it to only a few people and spending a lot of money on something that's boring as heck anyway, right? You want to celebrate collective accomplishments. This ought to be a, hey, look what we all got done this year. I really think it's important to let volunteers talk for themselves. I made the comment that I'm the after-dinner mint often. What's really bizarre about being invited to a recognition event, if you think about it, is I'm an outside person, and I'm supposed to say thank you to these people. I don't know them. I don't know what they do. Think about that. And then the worst is, I say to the volunteer coordinator who invites me, I said, what would you like me to say? Oh, Susan, I know you can be motivating. Say anything you want. And I say, that sounds very flattering, and I appreciate that, but you are missing an enormous opportunity. This is your chance to have me say what you want your executives to hear. And I'm very good at that. So if you tell me you really want a swimming pool, I'm totally capable of in my speech saying, and you know, one of the trends in the field is that volunteer coordinators have swimming pools now. I mean, I don't mean that I lie. I don't want to give that impression. But what I'm saying is that I think that it's very important to direct that and to think of the messages. But also, can having a guest speaker and get volunteers to talk and prepare, maybe a skit or a testimonial or whatever. What do they feel about volunteering? Make them meet each other. Make them meet the staff. Not allow the board of directors who are also volunteers to come and sit at their own table and not mingle with the others. I have been at volunteer recognition events and heard volunteers say, so that's what the executive director looks like. In other words, we can have it backfire. Surprise people with facts and stories, give an annual, this is where an annual report comes in. What do you do in an annual report? Not every single person's name. First of all, that's so dangerous because you spell things wrong, you leave somebody out. Oh, why would you do that to yourself? What you want to say is, how about the unexpected profile of who volunteers are? Of the 84 people we have, you might be interested in knowing that 40% of them have a master's degree. That 8% of them speak more than 2 languages. That X% of them have actually been clients of our organization in the past. You see what I'm getting at? Everybody, these are the occupations that are currently represented by these volunteers today, or that they retired from or are still doing. That everybody will find interesting, and it educates that these are not interchangeable parts. Recognition opportunities also mean don't wait until once a year to express appreciation. Informal recognition is critical, as close to an accomplishment as possible, and you want to create a climate of goodwill, and here's why. Treating volunteers nicely makes your organization a nicer place for the paid staff to work too. Back to our goal is not to make life easier for us, it's to improve the organization, which in turn makes it better for volunteers and, lo and behold, for us too. Strategy 10, very quickly, volunteer yourself and volunteers for unexpected services. In other words, be part of the strategic management team. If you hear they're planning something, go up and say, and how are we going to integrate volunteers into this from the beginning? Not wait till a day before the new thing opens. They call you and ask for volunteers, and you have to say, oh, gee, thanks. I have a few in the refrigerator and the freezer. I'll defrost them. They'll be ready by morning. Kind of adding to that. But also, if you have a volunteer who's an architect, go to the group that's considering building a new extension on your building and say, you know, one of our volunteers is an architect. Perhaps he or she would like to join this committee. That's what I mean by making it clear the role that they play. Go against type, meaning maybe you should volunteer not for something related to the soft stuff, but maybe you say, you know, I'd be interested in learning more about how the budgeting is here. I'd like to be on the budget committee. But you deal with free people. Well, not really, but anyway, I want to be on the budget committee. And then another thing is making sure that everyone at the top creates roles for volunteers. The message that often comes through loud and clear is, if I work here long enough, I will rise to a level of position where they'll never ask me to work with a volunteer again. So that's that. And the last strategy is ask for and give help. As I said, be specific in what you're asking of your executive, such as, where will you be speaking this month, and can you also distribute volunteer flyers? Go to the media people and say, what articles can I develop for you that really show how community support is involved here? Go to the IT staff and brainstorm how they can help you and you can help them in the IT needs that you have. And then convene all the people in your organization that are going out and doing presentations, outreach of various sites, and see how you can compare schedules and contacts and work together. It starts with you. Assume you are important and you will act accordingly. Be of value to the organization and the organization will see your value. fight for what is right for volunteers, because that is what your job is, and educate, educate, educate. So for those of you out in internet land, we went over by 4 minutes this way, but if you want to stick around, we are going to take some more questions and answers because we can. If you have to leave now, thank you so much for sticking around. I'm giving you back to Sue.
Okay. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you very much. I don't know if we want to discuss. Brilliant stuff. And you know, that volunteer coordinator was right, because whatever you say, you know, it will be inspirational. However, you're also right. What an opportunity to get you to speak. So we're just going to kind of have a bit of a changeover while there's a couple of people in the room I think need to dash off. It's brilliant to see you. Thank you for coming. I know we
Please
have,
take the handout.
Yes, come and, please come up and help yourself there. I know we did have a couple of other questions coming through, Chris, didn't we? Which I've got in front of me, which is fine. I'm just making sure there weren't any more. And I'm not sure if anybody in the room wants to kind of comment or ask questions, a couple of nods. Thank you so much for coming. So, just time to kind of stretch your arms. Like, yeah, I've got a couple of questions lined up here, Susan. And I think Adam's got a question in the room. So I think if we kick off with your question, Adam, if that's all right.
I'm not sure whether I'm thinking too much about this, but obviously there's people who are online, there are people here in the room, there are people that want to make a change. Obviously, in terms of the volunteer leadership sector as a whole, there are probably hundreds, thousands of more people out there who are doing it, who are not online, who are not here in the room, but unless we can influence them, then the actual environment, people might go and volunteer with them and think, oh, well, I don't want to volunteer again, or they'll have that extra experience. And how do we actually then, like, as well as influencing upwards, influencing outwards to other organisations so that we can actually engage with them and get them involved in the networks?
Well, you're talking, first of all, about how we build a profession, because we are right now a specialized job. I think the jury has been out for a long time on whether we're a profession, because a profession is an identity. No matter where you work, you carry that identity. If you're a lawyer, you're a lawyer, whether you work for a children's rights organization or you work for this, high court. But we tend to say, oh, I have a new job now. And so we're not in volunteering. I believe you can take a person out of volunteering, but you can't take volunteering out of the person, so that kind of thing. But so on number one, I think we do need to work together. I know here in England you're trying very hard to form the AVM, the National Association of Volunteer Managers. And I think that people need to become members of that and support it and network with one another where we can help that way. But the other thing about educating out is that I think we do sometimes only talk to ourselves and to each other. One of the things that can be done is to thinking about the positions in your organization. Where do your colleagues who are not in volunteer management but who are doing the work of yours, where do they go for their own professional development? Are there certain conferences that they attend? Are there certain journals that they read regularly? We need to be infiltrating those places. We need to do a workshop at a social workers convention. We need to be writing articles that curators of museums see about the role of volunteers. That's another way that collectively we can be reaching out and educating people through the venues that they're already paying attention to. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but does that give you a little more? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's some really great ideas, and I really like about kind of engaging where other people are and getting them to think about stuff. We had a question about volunteer-led organisations, so a smaller kind of volunteer-led organisation where the question is, few in powerful positions are making bad financial decisions, so how are you managing up kind of poor volunteers who are sort of running the show?
Well, first off, in an all-volunteer organization, the issues that occur between paid staff and volunteer staff occur between veteran volunteers and newcomers. In fact, volunteers can do worse things to one another than anything paid staff have ever dreamt up, so understand that. That question about who's been educated in volunteer management is the same for volunteers. Just because you're a volunteer doesn't mean you know how to work with other volunteers. In fact, the idea that being a volunteer means that you can work with other volunteers is like saying I've had brain surgery, I can do brain surgery. I mean, something comes in the middle, right? So the first thing is, and it is difficult because in an all-volunteer group, you've often elected these people or whatever, but it is a matter of going to bat for things like officer training or chairperson training. Most all-volunteer groups have terrible, terrible inconsistency and poor skills in how to run a committee. So you get some organizations where the committee chair never wants to rotate any authority, never wants to call new people. Others who run crummy meetings that nobody wants to go to because we don't hold to standards. It's a bigger issue than we can certainly handle at this point in the webinar, but I do believe that any member of an all-volunteer organization, and certainly anyone who is a chair or has some contact in a regular basis with the officers, could be suggesting that this should be a theme of a meeting, that this could be a training that is developed, that they could do it for their own professional development and personal development, and then begin to reach out to give people this opportunity. Form a book club and read some articles and have discussions about them. But it takes the first person to make the suggestion. And if you have hostile leadership against this, then you've got bad leadership to start with because it means they want to run it, they don't want the members running it. But now we're getting into human relations, which is really a bigger topic we can handle here. Anywhere. We can't handle it anywhere.
Chris, do we have anything else coming? Do we have anyone with a hand up who ever wanted to speak? No hands at all today. No. No, that's fine. We did have a question from Rob, which is kind of taking it beyond sort of the organisation.
Yes, what my advice is about how VMs can influence high-level organization, government funders to look at volunteering as well as giving. Because that is the same issue. They're all connected with it. Well, first of all, I certainly believe that anytime we write publicly, and whether that's a blog or part of Thoughtful Thursdays or it's articles, whatever, we do need to begin to use the phraseology of time donor and the philanthropist. I think those terms educate that group of people as well. But I think this is something that probably cannot be done very well one by one by one. I think that audience needs to be approached in some collective way. Now that might mean that in an area like Warrington that you may look at who your local officials are and you might invite them to some meeting where there's a dialogue. So on the local level, that's also true if there's a local funder that does a lot of funding, that can be done. On the national level, it is, of course, much harder, but one way to do it might be to start with the media. I mean, if you can get some reporter to get interested in this and really do some outreach, they might have some advice for you on how you begin to frame the issue. I will say one thing, though. I would like to see many more volunteer managers start responding online to blogs in general. In general, I don't mean in volunteer management. So, for example, I was reading with great interest and dismay the debate that went on during the Jubilee celebrations a couple weeks ago about that place that had the job seekers and whether they were volunteers or not volunteers, all that stuff that was going on, and there was a lot of bizarre stuff being said. Now, I don't care what side of the coin you're on, actually, but what I think, and I don't know that we all got enough details to actually have an opinion, but when a debate is raging somewhere in the public, and under the Cameron administration, it has been a lot because that's part of the platform. And yet, when I look at The Guardian and the online stuff, or I look at the other places where there's a lot of debate, I don't often see people I know responding. I don't see volunteers saying, I am someone in charge of volunteering. And what the 4 people ahead of me just said is prejudicial. It's not true. They don't have the fact. And I think if we make ourselves known that way, it is really an important thing. And I do believe that we have more opportunity than we think we have because we're also citizens and we can report on our beliefs that way. We may not be able to do it officially as part of our organization. We may not be able to say, I'm the volunteer coordinator at, because that would be making a public stand that would probably not be admitted. But you can still say, I'm a reader of this newspaper, and it happens that my profession is working with volunteers. That's your right to do.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. I'd be really interested in encouraging more managers and volunteers to do a lot more writing in that way. I think that's something that the group that sort of I've been working with we can
Right,
kickstart
absolutely.
of that. Let's do some of that.
The other thing is, remember that volunteers are private citizens in all ways, and they can do all kinds, start a letter writing campaign or an emailing campaign, and really go to bat for the things you think are needed.
Okay. Any other comments or questions from in the room? No. Okay. Oh yes, Lisa.
Just a comment more than anything else. I've had long discussions with Sue about the work I've been doing in my organisation. Sometimes it can be a little bit of an uphill struggle. But we've reviewed the policy this year, and we've actually put in specific things about it's everybody's responsibility within the
Good for
organisation
you.
to work with volunteers. But we've also talked about the language that people use when talking to and about volunteers. And I've actually started to head-on challenge people about the using things and not people. I had someone, who maybe had a bit of an inappropriate rant about volunteers in front of the volunteer I was sat next to. So I've actually started to put my own say, right, no, that's not right, you can't talk like that. You have to accept that there are volunteers in the office, and you are going to be talking about volunteers like that in their presence.
And how did they react? Were they defensive, or did they say, I just didn't think about it that way?
They accepted it. They have just had a bad
Right.
experience with a volunteer who they complained about it. So they were reacting as a knee-jerk.
Right.
But
I think it shows that when you put yourself forward, it's not that you're yelling at that person now. Here, you want to see what it feels like? But that people begin to realize that there is a protocol, there is a standard. You represent a point of view in a profession, and that they're accountable for that. And I think eventually it will get less and less need to do it, because you will make it clear in your organization this is how we behave. And as I said, that's not very courteous to anybody at any time. It's not just a volunteer issue.
I just wanted to sort of say, for the benefit of the recording that we're making, just to in case Lisa's points weren't picked up, and you made them really well, and I'm not going to kind of feed them back as well as you did, but basically what you were saying is that you have started to drive a lot of change in terms of reviewing policy and looking at language and how we speak about volunteers and challenging stuff, and building in where it is everybody's responsibility.
Which, by the way, the other thing we should challenge is everybody who says, I'm just a volunteer. The way you say to them is, excuse me, you've just used a four-letter word.
So, it's great advice. Okay. Well, listen, I'd like to thank you all for coming in person and all for listening in this afternoon. I hope it's been helpful for you. It's been brilliant to have Susan here. On the slide there, you've got details of how you can keep in touch with us. Don't forget that tomorrow is Thursday, which is Thoughtful Thursday for volunteer managers. And you can join us by following one of the Twitter accounts on the screen there. The best one is probably the movement for that particular issue. I'd like to say goodbye to our webinar participants, and thank you very much, Susan, for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was fun.